untie the cords of the yoke. This section really has to do still with our employees and the people who are under our leadership, under our influence. So I asked Caitlin to join us for this one because she loves ministry to the soul. And so we're going to touch that point. So the yoke refers to spiritual bondage normally, right? Spiritual bondage. And yoke very often is generational in nature. So there are spiritual bondage and yokes that are moving from generation to generation, and our employees may be caught up in that. So probably most all of us have been caught up in that to some extent, right? Different things, bondage that's coming through generation. We inherit a lot of great and awesome things from our parents, but some things that are really bad come through our family line, and now they're affecting our employees. So it's interesting that the images here is of untying. This is we don't have the image of like bringing an axe and chopping the cords of the yoke. It's actually a more like a process of untying the cords of the yoke. And so this involves ministry to the soul. Earlier today we were reading Isaiah 1, and it was talking about how it was referring to the nation of Israel, but I think it's a very accurate picture of our society and our condition today. They're covered with wounds and sores from the top of their head to the bottom of their feet. There was no soundness in them, and so you can say, well, that's referring to physical things. Well, it's actually physical, emotional, spiritual. So right now, we know that many people are struggling with anxiety, depression, pressure, suicidal thoughts. And those are wounding of the soul, emotional wounding and unhealthiness. So this is the condition. We're talking about our employees, and we're going to be untying the yoke of oppression in the workplace.
Yeah, so what that looks like a lot of the time. I think one of the questions we would have is, can you even do that in the workplace? Are you even allowed to talk about spiritual things in the workplace? Like, how does that walk out practically, right? And practically we saw you can break systems, right? That was what we saw in the chains of injustice, but this really is this is very spiritual in nature.
Yeah.
So sometimes people, he said, generationally, they can have mindsets, they can have, even, you look in science, genetic-wise, you carry on what you have from your family, but you also carry on your experiences. So say you grew up in a impoverished area, you might have a mindset that can't go past what you've already seen or already experienced. So one of the ways that we want to speak with our employees, it needs to be done out of a relationship. Like Mark said, it doesn't need to be this really harsh thing like hush up, it doesn't need to be like that. It needs to be built from a relationship, a holistic style of governing your employees or having responsibilities for your employees. So one thing that I personally would say was, maybe you see an employee that's really trying to climb the ladder, right? He wants to make more money. He wants to have high status because maybe he comes from a place where he didn't have that experience. That means that he came from more of a spirit of poverty, right? And so he's striving to provide maybe for his family, all good things. These are good things, but he's striving nonetheless. So one of our jobs as spiritual mentors would be to show him that hey, actually God is your provider. But that's a really hard thing to grasp when you haven't been provided for before, right? So our job is to kind of, yes, we want to pray for them and we want to attack that, but we want to do that gently and present them with the lie and the truth of what's going on. So you can do that by speaking truth to them, or you can do that by simply positioning them to hear from God themselves. And I don't know if I would necessarily do that in the workplace, but you could bring them outside of the workplace and, like we said, have a holistic relationship with them, not just as boss or master, but as friend and mentor.
Excellent. So, of course, it's not my recommendation that you run head-on into the Department of Labor.
Please don't.
But really, this is an important point. And I think Caitlin mentioned it. You can see that yokes can be very subtle in nature. This, for example, a yoke that affects practically the entire world, whether you're saved or not, is this idea that there's not enough for everyone. Okay, that's a spiritual yoke. It's a bondage. So we're gonna untie that yoke, but if we're in an environment, in a labor environment, we're gonna have to divest ourselves from a lot of the religious or talk or vocabulary, right? So it's actually helping people explore what they believe. So if you believe there's not enough for everyone, your attitude towards your coworkers and your whole function within the team is going to be distorted, right? So that is, for instance, the idea of generosity or the idea of compassion will be almost impossible for you, because your generosity to somebody else will mean that maybe your kid will go hungry
Exactly.
or won't be able to have braces on their teeth one day, or you're going to be passed up for a promotion because somebody else got the one promotion that was available, So as we minister to people, we can minister, in many different ways. We're just going to divest ourselves from the spiritual, over-spiritualized
Right.
vocabulary, So this is a process. And it's a process that the Lord places as part of this contract or agreement, So, there are no laws in the United States, at least, that you can't do good for your employees. Sometimes it feels that way, but you can actually do good. You can buy somebody lunch. You can buy them a cup of coffee. You can show generosity towards your employees and the decisions you make. And then you can begin to, for instance, in Laser World, our core business, we have these as our core principles, and we actually go through the teaching, not only for every employee, for everyone we interview. And so we say, these are our core principles: generosity, compassion, trust. And then we have to be a little subtle, but we say, dignity and respect. But then I also tell them that I use that vocabulary because of, some people want to restrict, how we express spiritually certain concepts. But by doing that, I'm actually cheating them of the deeper meaning. So the principle is actually identifying the image of God in my coworker. So whether, sometimes we do that whether they're Christian or not. And then, so the idea is that if you introduce a concept that is very, very clearly and identifiably a Christian concept, you should usually talk to the person, and say, hey, there's this principle, it's awesome, I find it in the Bible, this is coming from a Christian perspective. Is that okay with you, for me to share it with you? And if they say, yeah, that's fine with me, then you're fine,
Right.
You do it. We don't have to be intimidated by the fear of, it's actually a fear of lack of provision, right?
Right, yeah. Actually is.
I'm going to minister to my employees, and then somebody's going to sue me for $100 million, and then my children aren't going to have enough food to eat or braces on their teeth, right? So we have to be careful sometimes that we ourselves aren't wearing yokes while we're trying to help our employees
Untie the yokes.
untie their yokes. So this is, you can see it, but this, I think the core concept here is the Lord saying, you need to minister to your employees, minister to them, And when we serve our employees, we're ministering to them. Every action that we take is intentional. Whether
Yes.
you like it or not, your employees will watch every aspect of your
yes.
life. They will watch your marriage relationship, your relationship to your children. People, you're in a position of influence, so you're influencing them. And by walking out, freedom, they themselves will you can aid in that process of helping them be free. So untying the cords of the yoke, spiritual bondage, belief systems, lies that we believe, right? So, and don't over-spiritualize this. Like, the yoke can be something as simple as the law of supply and demand that we've been taught in economics, right? So there are many concepts that keep us bound, but they're actually doctrines that are not true. So we know that there's enough for everyone, right? We believe that. And the arm of God is not too short to provide for the needs of his children. We know there's enough for everyone. But the world teaches us 100% scarcity of resources, supply and demand. These are laws of nature, and they're not. You know, so thank you, Caitlin, for joining us for this part. I know Caitlin loves ministry to the soul, and the idea of being able to do that as part of our agreement with God is, I think, a very important concept and one that we can walk out.
Yeah, absolutely. And to not forget that, like, the smallest action can influence somebody. So,
Absolutely.
like you said, you could go buy a cup of coffee as a leader, and in that moment, they don't need that, but they're feeling cared for. So if they believe something as simple as, like, I am not cared for, you're breaking that right there. It doesn't have to be this
Absolutely.
huge thing. You're actively going against that in a very subtle way. So it's a calm, it's a simple, it's easy. You know, Jesus says his burden is easy, his yoke is light. So when we're talking about breaking yokes, make sure it's light.